Hi, let's talk about improvising adventures, writing session material on the fly for your D&D game. Now, I'm going to get to, I guess, next month, the second part of my How I Design a Wilderness Adventure micro series. I'm going to iterate the adventure I designed there. But I've been on holiday and I've not had lots of time to prep my games, and that led me to thinking there's hopefully a fairly short video, comparatively short video I can do on the topic of basically improvising and designing on the fly, because that's something I think most of us who run games a lot do a lot, particularly depending on the play style you're into. You know, sometimes you are just under prepped. I'm using that as a neutral term, under prepped in one sense or another, and you need to improvise the mission, the locale, the adventure, to some extent or another. Maybe not the whole thing, but you just don't have a complete adventure in front of you. Remember, even when you pick up a module and you're running it, you'll often be like, man, I have to run this on the fly. I don't know everything about this, or maybe I should expand this room when they get here. That happens anyway, but I'm talking more about when you don't have as much material as you might like, perhaps, to make it easy for you to run. And when I say under-prepped, I don't mean it as automatically, oh, I screwed up. It could mean two things, really. It could mean just actually under-prepped, i.e. there are things you know you should have prepared that you haven't had the time to prepare. Again, it happens to all of us. Or it could mean, if you like, a more generic under-preppedness, in the sense that events take a left turn and you haven't had the chance, obviously, to fill in every detail of that left turn before it happens. You never knew it was going to happen. Or perhaps there are a lot of potential routes for your players, so there's just so many things they could have done, you can't prepare all of them, at least in detail. And in a more open game, like the games that I run, that is more common. If there are more player choices, there is more work for the DM, and it's either going to come beforehand with exhaustive writing, or it's going to happen as things happen. You know, and you're going to have to come up sometimes with stuff as you go. Particularly random encounters are a very good example of that as a actual core part of the game. And of course, some DMs actively hate random encounters and other things, and will, even if they want the playstyle, they will program in and pre-roll encounters and randomize things to avoid that. So I understand that. But here we're talking about what happens in any of those situations where you don't have the material to run. And basically, you know, when players turn up at the manor house, or follow a rumour you've forgotten you told them, or they investigate a mystery you haven't fleshed out yet, you've got to do something, because otherwise the game stops, doesn't it? You can't detail every part of a rich, dense world all at once. Giving players freedom bears the cost that they're going to do stuff you're not prepped for, and that will leave you as the DM scrambling for material. Basically, I think there are three kinds of unprepped or under-prepped adventure situations. Now, one, in the most extreme case, you literally have nothing. You know, you just sit down with no idea and you just go. And I've never probably done exactly that, I don't think, beyond very quick pick-up sessions where I pick an adventure module up and run it. You know, I don't create my own stuff. I just say, oh, I've not run this module and I think I could. Let's do it. That's number one. I'm not really going to talk about that. Number two, I bet there are good people who do talk about that, though, good stuff on that. Two, you have very minimal details on the place or context where the PCs are present. For instance, you've got a sentence or two for a whole dungeon. If you look at what I've got on the screen, this is a key, a very rough key for an area of my Borderlands setting, which you can see in some cases it's just a sentence, in some cases it's 2 paragraphs. It's not very much detail on those locations. It's very minimal. There's a paragraph summary of a mystery. There's that kind of thing. Or third, you have a very lightly keyed dungeon or wilderness or whatever, but with some degree of detail already present. And an example of that would be, let's say, the dungeon adventure that I designed in 2 parts on this channel, where I didn't exactly end up detailing lots of it. But I could go back now and I think I could improvise around that and run it if I had to, if we're in the Borderlands and my players went there. Obviously, situations 2 or 3 require more or less work. You know, the one that's less detailed requires more work. But I'm going to suggest a couple of things or techniques or systems that help me cope with the need to create and improvise and on the fly. And this is hardly exhaustive. I can't pretend it's the best system, in the sense it's just my system. You know, if you've got systems for improvisation, then please tell me in the comments. But this is what works for me, and I think I've got 4 kind of questions or headings or techniques or something. And the first is really meta. Should should you come into that kind of situation, the best preparation you could have is to have already read a lot of adventures. Creation requires consumption or something like that. When people say, oh, I love writing, I never read anything, I hate reading, but I love writing, you've got a very high possibility that their writing is limited, because we reform and remodulate tradition when we write. I don't mean that in the sense there's not invention and originality. What I mean is that language, you learned language somewhere, didn't you? And it's the same with style, technique, ideas. You're getting things from somewhere. And so reading a lot of adventures and reading a lot of theory and reading a lot of gamecraft is some of the best preparation you can have to write adventures, whether in a kind of prep sense where you write a whole module beforehand and then run it, or when you're improvising stuff, because it becomes the library from which you draw. It becomes the kind of measure, the canon by which you're kind of like, oh, where do I measure up to? What am I trying to do? What kind of influences are coming into this adventure? So the first piece of advice I'd give from my experience is, and in fact I think this is probably the, if you like, the most didactic RB, is you've got to read. You've got to have a large head library of adventure material if you want to write really good adventures. The second point is, well, it's a question really. Should you delay? If you're under prepped and your players say we're going somewhere, should you delay? Should you, and sometimes probably you should just say, oh, look guys, I haven't had my head in the right place to prep that. It depends on your table communication. It's not necessarily stopping the suspension of disbelief to just say, with a good group of players who have a good rhythm, I think it'd be better if we did something else. The problem there is that it depends what you're saying they should do. Are you saying their characters should not go somewhere? Could you please do something else just while I prep that? Could you? Maybe it's something where you say, oh great, we'll do that. I need to put some thought into that. Should we switch over to our B team? Or should we switch over to our Gamma World game? Maybe that's a reasonable thing. But I'd say if you're trying to stay within the world, it's very dangerous, I think, to just start saying, I'd rather your characters didn't do that. Because I think eventually it's going to chip away at the sense that players should choose to do things. They're going to start looking for cues from you about what you have prepped and what you want to run. And I think that's very dangerous for an immersive, realistic campaign, a simulationist campaign, certainly. Of course, if you're not running that kind of campaign and everything's incredibly prepped anyway, then it's not a problem. But if you are running that kind of campaign, you don't want to kind of quantum ogre them off to something else you want. Now, that said, there's no reason that you can't add in detail in the world on the way. There's no reason you can't draw in other things quite organically and realistically because they're travelling somewhere. But when the rubber hits the road, sometimes you've just got to say, look, I'm going to go for this. So that's the second point is, should you delay? Depends on the situation. Now, the two very practical points, I guess we can then go forward with. You've got your meta library of ideas. You've made your decision about timing. Do you delay so you can actually prep, or do you just go for it? You're then in the midst of the improvisation. You've decided you're doing this, and I guess I've got 2 points then on that. The first is, mash in modules or stuff you've written already for other contexts, whether it's by other people or by you. Steal. Just get stuff, be like, oh, okay, this is there. If you say there is a dungeon in this hex and it has undead in it, you just go and find a module that either you've written or someone else has with undead, and you might reskin a bit of it, but you just say, look, this is what's there. And this might be less satisfying than the kind of fantasy heartbreaker you had planned of a really unique undead dungeon. And there's a question for you there about how you design stuff. But sometimes that's just a good idea, just being able to say, look, this is just what it is. This is where we are today, and this means my players can play something fun, and the stakes for me in terms of creation are lower because I've got something to build on, and maybe you'll improve it. But that's the first way of doing it, is just kind of steal something. And I think you're going to not want to do that, I guess, particularly in situations where the fantasy heartbreaker matters more. If you designed a setting and there is a big bad in it, and suddenly they've gone to the big bad's base. I mean, I don't know how you've got that far without having any idea about the big bad's base, but of course it will happen. It happens to the best of us. In that case, you might be reluctant to say, I guess I'll just take Ravenloft and put it there. That will be disappointing probably for you as someone whose main task is as the curator of the setting. And that is the thing I'd say. I think the DM is someone running a world, not a story. So in that sense, the disappointment is not about the story, but about the setting. The fact that the world has become less rich because of it. But in most situations, it's fine, particularly for lots of minor things where you kind of drop a rumour early in the campaign that there are some bandits somewhere and you've never thought about it again, but there's a reward and the player's like, 500 gold, that could be quite useful because we just need some cash to buy some stuff, and bandits seem like something we can do at level 3. So they go there and you don't have something. Well, in that case, just find anything that has bandits in it and you're probably fine. You're probably not going to ruin the world by just having generic bandits. Now, of course, you can reskin it. If you'd said they were prickle men bandits, little hedgehog men like the Prickle Folk in my Borderlands, then you make them all Prickle Folk, and you might add a bit of set dressing from your meta library. Be like, what's something that might be more Prickle Folkish than this generic Dragonfoot, like the Footprints magazine kind of generic 1E era bandit layer. You could be like, I don't really like this kind of very generic section. Maybe I'll throw in one room. And that brings us on to our fourth and final point, and the second kind of very practical improvising point. The final form is just improvising stuff, isn't it? It's just making stuff up in your head and putting it out there for the players. And in a way, this feels a bit like trying to explain to someone how to paint. And I don't mean the technique of painting, but it's like, how do you come up with good things to paint, Leonardo da Vinci? And how do you make them so mysterious and interesting and beautiful? Is a bit of a complex question. I don't know that many artists or novelists or whatever could answer it very easily. But I think the practical thing is that sometimes when you're in the midst of that and you're improvising on the fly, sometimes you just say, give me a moment, and you take a couple of minutes to just sketch something out. And so it is like designing an adventure, but you only have a couple of minutes to do the bare bones of it. So that's one thing, is just give yourself space and time so that you can do that. The kind of other thing is that, well, what happens when they get to a room that you haven't detailed? What happens if, in this one, let's look again at this example of a wilderness thing. Some of them, like the dungeons, the 3 dungeons that I've marked, I think I'd need to take 5 minutes and be like, okay, great, give me a moment, let me just check something. And you just tap out a few things and you say, okay, that's roughly what's there. But other ones, like the cliff nest of the miniature rocks, I haven't even put a sentence there because I know what that is. If I had to improvise based on that, I'd say, okay, so it's up on the cliffs. There's going to be an obstacle going up because it's a cliff nest. And then there are these miniature rocks. So they're not going to be the full statted rocks. They're going to just be something similar. So I know roughly I could just go for a giant hawk kind of thing with a reskin. But what's the point of going up there? Well, there's going to be treasures hidden up there, perhaps, that they steal or that they gather or whatever from adventures they feed to their young, perhaps, or perhaps they are intelligent and they're guarding something or they have wisdom and they're kind of feral but incredibly intelligent both at once. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? So you say, okay, so you're going to have to ascend the cliff somehow, and that's going to be complicated, and then maybe you put in just something on the way, and then there are these rocks and they might attack you or not. And in a sense, that's something where I don't need to take 5 minutes. I could probably come up with that in less than 1 minute based on the internal coherence of the idea. The dungeons, I need time, and the stuff in between, say the Naiad's pool here. There's a Naiad who lives by an entrancing pool and hunts menfolk, often turning them into stags. So there's a Narcissus thing going on there, of course, and an Actaeon. She has info on the Waterfall cult, who are at location I below. She has vine helpers and treasure, the nearby Prickle Folk. Avoid the Naiad. So in that case, I'm kind of in between that. There's 2 locations there, Prickle Folk village or burrow and Naiad pool. I don't really need to key them, but I might need to take a moment more to think about what's going into them. It's not just, they've got to get up the cliff, I'll put an obstacle on the cliff, and they've got to negotiate with feral but very intelligent creatures. With the Naiad's pool instead, I'm going to have to think, okay, what are the stats for a vine helper? What is a thing I can just drop in there? It's going to be like a 2-hit dice creature, probably in this context. The treasure, what treasure is going to have? Probably like 2,000 gold worth of treasure, 3,000 maybe. She's going to want to negotiate, and that might be that she has some kind of perverse request for menfolk in the party. If she's not going to hunt them, she wants something else. Or it might be that she only negotiates with female members of the party, or whatever other rule you come up with. And in that case, again, you go from the internal situation and you say, I need to come up with as little as possible here, but I need to know, in this case, what the Naiad is willing to negotiate on if you want the information, what and what obstacles are there if you're going there to kill her for her treasure. And that's the Vine Helpers particularly, as well as her in the Entrancing Pool. Perhaps the Entrancing Pool, of course, the treasure could be at the bottom. That would make sense. So you've got a water obstacle there too. And then the Prickle Folk, okay, so the Prickle Folk are over there. They can, in this on-the-fly session, be very generic. You know, Prickle Folk are cute, mostly cute little hedgehog people. If you find them, then they're going to be scared, but and aren't going to be willing to help you go to the Naiad. But if you want some information about where she's hidden her treasure, maybe they'll know that. So you kind of just, that's what you need to know. So you come up with your character, you know, like a slightly bumbling, afraid Prickle Folk, because that's what you know they are in your head. And you keep it as simple as possible. So to kind of go over those examples again, when you're improvising on the fly, something simple, cliff nest of the miniature rocks. As long as you know the internal situation, most of us, once we've written that one sentence, can just say, okay, I wish I'd detailed this more, I wish I had more time, but today I think I can just have them climb up, have an obstacle on the way, and then they need to somehow please these things. Maybe they need to bring meat or something, but that's up to the players then. You leave it to the players. You know the situation, and if they come up with a bad plan, these giant hawk things attack them. If they come up with a good plan, they get to negotiate or whatever the particular target is there. With the Naiads pool, you've got a slightly different thing where in one case you do need to kind of quickly detail this one wilderness location of the pool itself. There's a pool, there's treasure in the pool. I need to come up with a couple of items, as well as maybe, you know, you could always use random tables for that. But you can often think, well, I think she's got a +2 dagger, a +2 silver dagger or something very, you know, very interesting and special. She's got a piece of jewelry like this, and she's got some gold or something like that. You know, she's got Vine Helpers, so you need to come up with a generic stat line for that. They're going to be 2 hit dice. They're going to be attacking for 1d4, but they're going to have an entangle thing. The Entrancing Pool is going to be a save versus spells. And at that point, I've got a situation. And the Prickle Folk, as I say, in another case where you could make it into an interesting mini location, you don't have the time when you're improvising. So in this particular case, so you just keep it simple. They go to the village of the Prickle Folk, they find them or the burrow, and you come up with a generic single Prickle Folk who can help them or not help them, depending on their interactions. So just to go over those 4 points again. The first, meta, read a lot. The second, decide whether it's right to delay the section of the game until you can prep, but stay away from delaying if you can. The third is steal from other stuff. Just dump other stuff onto your game because that's what it's there for. That might not be all satisfactory, in which case you're going to have to do something else, and that something else is develop the internal situation on the fly. And that might mean taking a couple of minutes to just key something. It might mean almost instantaneously being like, okay, this is just the obvious thing that's going to happen here. And sometimes it might be somewhere in between where you're trying to draw out the couple of notes you have, and you just need to add a sentence to each of them. She has Vine Helpers, 2 hit dice, 1d4 damage. I guess it'd be a reflex save. No, possibly, a fortitude save if you're using that kind of system. Or a save versus paralysis or something. So you get the idea. That's, I guess, an overview of some of the ways I try to decide how to develop material that I haven't had the time to prep. And I do that moderately often, you know, every few sessions. That's probably where I'm at in one or other of my games. Now, there are probably other more detailed techniques that you have, and I'd like to hear about them, as I'm sure would other people watching this. So do share those in the comments. As I say, next time I will probably continue on the kind of how do I iterate a wilderness adventure? How do I make it more than this? This is the first stage of development of a wilderness adventure, and we'll return to what I did last time and we'll iterate that and develop the key parts of it next time. So, till next time.